Hi, my name is Tinashe Mukogo, currently independent consultant and also founder of Money and Moves, where I'm covering the finance and strategy behind the most important companies in Africa and the rest of the world.
Welcome to the African Tech Roundup, Tinashe.
Thank you. No, pleasure being here.
So I was trying to recall the very first article I discovered of yours on the internet. It was obviously not the first one you put out, as I later discovered. And at this point, Money and Moves has turned into a staple for me. And needless to say, many other smart people across the world. But yeah, I looked it up, and it turns out it's the one called "The End of Meikle's Hotel: Why It Was Sold and the Big Lesson for You." For those of you who aren't familiar with the Meikle's brand, didn't grow up in Zimbabwe, you and I have that in common, being Zimbabweans. Meikle's was quite a big deal in its heyday, and so obviously this struck a chord on many levels. But before we do the whole thing of like digging into some of the stuff you've written, I found most interesting, including that article and maybe some of yours. What led to you starting to publish yourself in this way and stuff you're learning from the market?
So over the last, I think, let's call it 9 years, 8-9 years, got a lot of experience sort of like traveling around the world, working in different businesses, seeing a whole lot of things, getting all these learnings and these insights, but without really an outlet to sort of share some of these things. Because I always enjoyed writing. And so I feel like it was in May 2023. Yeah. I actually remember it was after the football season had ended, because I was like, oh, no, I got 2 hours a week extra because I don't watch any football. So let me start doing something, which was the writing. And then just pretty much started. And I remember, I think one of the earlier ones was writing about Econet, actually. And it seemed as if this was a gap, let's call it like that there wasn't a lot of coverage about business particularly. And more so, I think, in the Zimbabwean context, because historically, there's been a lot of discussion about politics, but very little about like what's happening in the business world. So it seemed to get a little bit of traction, and there was sort of a good meeting between a need and a willing supply, in a sense. And yeah, just started writing a couple of times a week and have done that pretty much since. Slowed down a little bit over the last few months because things got a little bit busier, but picking up again. So yeah, that was pretty much how it started. Just spotting a need and deciding, you know what, this is something that I'm interested in doing. And I've always had sort of a passion for like the media space in general as well.
Give us a sense of what your skills, experience, expertise, portfolio look like.
So I went to INSEAD for business school, and INSEAD, from a strategic perspective, is known for blue ocean strategy. I think that's why we even have the Blue Ocean Institute. So I always think about blue ocean strategy pretty much in everything. And I think it's just such a useful analogy for everything that you do in your life, right? The basic premise, hyper simplified, of blue ocean is that trying to find uncontested market space. So trying to find an area where the competition is irrelevant, where you're so unique in what you're doing that pretty much no one else can replicate whatever you're doing. And so that's always been like something that I thought about. And so like, for example, with a lot of the writing, I talk about business, of course, which I think is quite a broad category. There's a lot of business content, a lot of business reporters. But where I think that there's a little bit of an advantage that I have is that, one, operational. So typically the path to being a business reporter, right, is through journalism. Whereas the path I've taken is through corporate, like actually working in these organizations, the companies. So that's one element. The other element is, so I was at Deloitte for like 9 years, did a chartered accountancy background, which also means that from an understanding like financial statements, financial reports, I know them inside out. Like I can pretty much tear up a set of financial statements in a pretty robust way without like a lot of additional overhead. So that was another thing that sort of like kept creating filters to decrease the competition in a sense.
Yeah, I don't know too many CAs or even former consultants who care to deploy that skill set in basically practicing journalism.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then you have the other extreme where you have people who have the skill sets, right? Like your CFAs particularly. I'm just going to use CFA because that's like a very known financial qualification. So those are your analysts. And if you read a typical analyst report, it's written for a motivated reader. Like I always said, no analyst report has ever gone viral, right? No one is just going to pick up an analyst report and say, oh man, I want to share this with my friends. That doesn't happen because the language, the way it's written is very technical, EBITDA, blah, 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 all this stuff. And that doesn't appeal to a common reader. So for me, there's a white space there where you're taking your practical experience, your accounting background, you're studying business and strategy, and then you're taking the other side, which is just the ability to communicate and to write in an easily accessible way, and putting that together such that the informed reader still finds value, and the someone who's not as the sophisticated reader also still finds value, and then deploying that on social media using the methodologies that you need to be able to catch attention and virality on the internet. So applying all of that stuff together to come to what I would like to believe is an element where there's uncontested market space to some extent. And the thing about blue ocean thinking, let's call it that, it's always about you. Like, what do you have that can differentiate yourself, right? Other people have other things, right? I don't have the context or the sources when it comes to journalism that most people would have. I don't have the journalistic background. And so I pretty much write everything based on publicly available information. And the theory is that I should be able to break down a set of financial statements, financial reports, the news, analyze it in a way that I can actually break the news without actually knowing the news. And that's what I've been trying to do as much as possible. And the fact that it's publicly verified, I also like that because that's also now my audit background. Everybody can see what I'm saying, and you might not agree with it, but the evidence is there, and you can choose how to discern or to decipher it, or to take it or not, take it or leave it, basically.
If I reflect on what I appreciate most about your work, it's accessible but sophisticated, and it delivers on a depth of what is now popularly referred to as data journalism or data-led journalism that lots of people are trying to mainstream and trying to enthuse more traditional journalists to engage. And it's doing it with an ease, to your point, that doesn't require privileged hookups. So when I think about like another platform I really enjoy, which is an international, an American platform, The Information, the whole premise is, we're plugged into, conversations you might not, and so subscribe. With you, on the other hand, there's almost like a democratization sensibility baked into the way you're going about it that I actually quite like. And I know it kind of undermines people who want to sell like the exclusivity and, trying to create an in-crowd dynamic and a sense of scarcity from that perspective, where I think it's counter to what I think good journalism should be.
For like The Information, for them, that's how they, I guess, trying to build their blue ocean, right? Try to be on the inside. Everything that I've deduced, you could theoretically deduce the exact same thing, right? Because it's all publicly available information. So I don't have any special advantage with anything that I publish than anyone else, right?
Except, I guess, again, your profile of skills, expertise, experience coming to bear here. I've found connectivity being really, really key, i.e. the relationships people have, the network access, the reputational equity. To what degree, if at all, has that been key? I mean, listen, bro, like what I understand the INSEAD network to be, I mean, it's not nothing that you got to go to school there and you sort of plugged in, and Deloitte obviously comes with not just the experience you got there, but being plugged into a network and the clout I'd imagine of coming out of an environment like that. You were at Siemens. To what degree has that been key to almost defining what only you could do?
So, I mean, that's an interesting thing because I actually feel like a lot of those elements haven't yet kicked in as much and probably may need to kick in the future, because there's a very weird dynamic with what I'm trying to do now, in that I'm writing about companies where I know these people or they know me. So it's a very awkward dynamic. There's a significant amount of the stuff I've published which has been related to Zimbabwe, right? But I haven't been living in Zimbabwe for a couple of years. So there's a little bit of distance, even though I'm still involved there. So that has actually helped in a weird way, because if you are in that environment and you're publishing these things, some people don't take it very kindly. And if I'm dependent on the ecosystem, then you can't publish these things, which I also think is a little bit of an advantage. Because I mean, I've written about, just in the Zimbabwean context, Econet, InScore, OK Zimbabwe, Meikles, Zimplats, Delta Beverages, I mean, many, many more.
For context, that is literally the creme de la creme of blue chip listed businesses in Zimbabwe, some of which are still regionally, even continent-wide leaders in their segments, some of which at their peak in Zimbabwe's perhaps more glorious economic era would have literally been world leading, if not regionally leading. And these are still, for the most part, fairly powerful and important and impactful businesses that basically touch almost every facet of Zimbabwean everyday life. And you go, yep, I'm going to write about those.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if I were to estimate, it's probably 90% of the market cap of listed companies is what I've sort of covered. You can't pay me for an opinion. It's not always necessarily going to be positive, but it's always going to be fact-based. And I actually would say that I don't write anything to come to a conclusion that this is positive or negative. It's to highlight what is happening, what could be happening, and what could happen next. But some people aren't fans of that. And that can be problematic. I'm working in these organizations, these corporates, so I know how these things work, right? Like the board of directors, for example, can get an article which is critiquing something that the management team may not have necessarily communicated to the board of directors. So it can be a very tricky situation. And if you imagine a CEO of a large company in the country, that can have massive impacts if you're trying to generate revenue from that country via advertising, which is oftentimes the common way to generate money for people who do publishing or media or whatever it is. So automatically that revenue stream is cut out. We've basically never received any sort of income from anyone. And recently, like maybe 2 months ago, I put out the first sort of say, hey, if you're interested in sponsoring, just reach out. And then when I was having some discussions, just brainstorming with some people, I realized that actually I probably can't do that as well, because if an organization comes to me and says, hey, we want to book out the next 6 months of advertising spot, right? Like one company.
Dominate the public sphere or the sphere you've created.
Right? Like that just doesn't look right.
Also, if you had anything even mildly critical or to say about them at all, probably won't be published in that 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would still publish it, but like it just doesn't.
They'd hate it.
Yeah, they'll hate it, and it's an awkward situation. So the only thing that I maybe might consider is like if it's like I think AdSense does the serving of the advertisements for you, right? So you don't have to have an interaction with the company. So maybe that's a path to follow.
So now we're actually delving into something interesting, which I didn't expect for us to be talking about at this point in the conversation. But it's interesting because it does speak to why you're doing this, and this is a hot take. Everything is propaganda, right? And I mean that in the most agnostic, benign definition of what propaganda is. In other words, whether you're conscious of it or not, there's always an agenda. Whether or not that agenda is genuinely a good agenda and a good intent or a good ambition, there's always an agenda at play. And as media makers, I think it's fair to be quizzed and even interrogated about like why do you do this? Why aren't you deploying what is clearly an incredibly valuable portfolio of skill, experience, and expertise to, I don't know, working for the next corporate or whatever? And why should we buy into your very specific framing of independent analysis and observation and critique? So I say that really just to put myself out there as well. And in our chats offline, we've obviously talked a lot about this, but you're speaking now to this pragmatic need to, as you do this thing that is obviously very valuable, there's a need to figure out sustainability, if not ideally profitability. And I guess that's what you were kind of reflecting on now. Yeah.
So it's an interesting one. And I'm a big fan of Fred Swaniker. He's always inspired me by that whole statement about do hard things. He used to have like a 3-part framework. I think one was, is it big enough? Number 2, something along the lines of, are you uniquely positioned to do it? And then thirdly, being passionate. And so when I think about this particularly, I can answer all 3 with a yes. And of course, maybe the 4th one hidden in that, is it hard to do? This is incredibly hard to do.
I would have added a 4th, can you do this sustainably in a way that enables you to be the spouse you want to be? You're a married man, as I am, that enables you to be an active participant in your society and your family and, make a decent livelihood, live in a decent neighborhood.
That 4th also sits into that, is it a hard thing to do? It's okay if it's hard. It's bad if it's impossible. So distinguishing between those two, right? So to go back to like the motivation type topic that you mentioned of it, right? If you look at, I guess, how financial markets work broader, coverage drives investment. And this is why like companies get listed, because they actually want to get more coverage. So the more coverage there is, the better people can make investment decisions and estimate their risk. And as a result, the more investment that goes into that particular space. I remember talking to some senior bankers in SA here, and they were saying that, look, when it comes to coverage, like looking at markets at company level, it's pretty much just South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, maybe, right? Maybe a couple of other companies in other markets. But places like Zimbabwe, zero. In fact, I think there was a report that RMB put out which said that Zimbabwe is the worst investment destination in Africa, in a sense, based on their ratings. So when you think about that and you think about what that impact is, I was like, you know what? This is something that I want to see if I can also support that whole investment ecosystem, the understanding of what's happening with companies in the country, because I think that helps to promote investment, right? I'll give you just an example, right? Because as we go into the AI age, a lot of people are going to rely on large language models for investment advice or for investment guidance. And what do these things use? They trained on data, predominantly text, what's been written, what's been said about countries, companies, and the like, right? And for a lot of the articles that I've published, if you ask AI about a company, it's going to refer to something that I've written about that company. And that could be the difference between someone deciding, sitting in the middle of New York or Singapore, whatever, whether or not they want to look into a company in Zimbabwe or not. So there is value that's there, and this is like, it's very long term.
That answers a question I had about like, why Zimbabwe? Why did you start with that? You kind of answered it in terms of like, you're uniquely placed, not because you're based there, but you're from there. So it's a place you care about, but also is part of your origin law as a professional, as now a writer and publisher. But it's also, as you've pointed out, part of that Blue Oceans strategy thinking that you apply. And so that's actually neatly put together. And I think you also addressed really nicely the broader agenda, agnostic of where you would have tried to start doing this first. This could have applied to, say, Burkina Faso.
Yeah. So, and to clarify as well, like, a lot of the way I think about strategy when I write is the way I look at strategy for myself as well. So like what I'm writing about, I'm actually applying. One of the strategic principles about expansion is that you should always have a very strong home base before you expand elsewhere. So for me, my home base, which is the easiest accessible market, was Zimbabwe. And if you actually look at the history of sort of my writing, there's a time where I really started to get a lot of coverage from South Africa. In fact, I wrote an article in Jumia that also went quite viral. I think it was viewed about 600,000 times, whatever it is. So I've written a lot about other companies as well. But I then decided to maybe zero in and hone the craft a little bit, focusing on Zim to get the home base tight. And then now more and more, I'll start reaching into the region in terms of writing about other markets as well. The skill set's the same, the knowledge is the same. But from a strategic perspective, it's always good to get the home base tight before you expand elsewhere. So that's why I always say the most important companies in Africa and the rest of the world. I'm still working through the Africa part, but the rest of the world is also going to come at some point.
Starting with home base.
We
went down this rabbit hole, and just to come back to, what got us to dive in to begin with was that statement about sustainability. And so broadly, you've painted a picture for where this fits and why this is good for the ecosystem, and why not just you, but platforms like African Tech Roundup and others are overall acting to build a more healthy and a more widespread interest in doing business in Africa. So then, like, how do you make this work?
I mean, I think about this a lot. And in general, media and journalism is a bad business to be in.
I suppose it's media and airlines.
So let me rephrase this. Media is bad business, but a phenomenal asset. And I think the best example of this, I would say, is actually the recent elections in the US with Elon Musk and Twitter. Because Twitter is essentially like a news service, if you think about it, right? And he bought it for 44 billion or whatever it was. He's not made anything close to that, and is not ever likely to make anything close to that. However, by being in charge of Twitter and being able to make decisions around Twitter, that media asset has resulted in his company's market caps increasing plus 50 billion. The value that Twitter's ownership has given to Elon Musk right now is absolutely huge. And this is one of the challenges that exists within the media space, that it tends to be most valuable when paired with another asset. But also, if you are pairing it with another asset, it also then typically means that there's an element of independence that is lost. Now, advertising was historically what was the primary source for media, right? The problem is in Africa, advertising revenue is very low in general, number one. Number two, it can also have a big impact on independence, right? Especially in my case, where the people who are the primary advertisers are companies, which I'm writing about, and not always necessarily in a positive sense, right? So
or at very least in a sense that they want to project at the time.
I think that's actually the right way, because I actually don't think I've written anything that's negative. But
I don't. That's actually why I wanted to correct you, because otherwise, you start to position yourself as this investigative guy who's like breaking whatever Meekles didn't want to know, didn't want you to know about them. And it's like, actually, no, it's all public. And it's like, to the point you made, yeah?
And that's actually a very good point. And I think, thanks for reminding me, because oftentimes when people call you critical, that's what sticks in your head, but it's actually not the case. And in fact, I've had a couple of discussions with a number of CEOs who have said that actually what you said was in some cases tough, but actually very fair and very factual. And that's another thing that I've always tried, and I want to try to do, is that, look, I'm not trying to make your job hard or anything like that. In fact, anything, my primary goal is to make your jobs easier, because sometimes the public is misinformed about the challenges that these companies are having. And actually, there is a need for someone to just say what's happening. Right now, for example, there's the whole topic about formal retailers, right? And they're really struggling, particularly in the Zimbabwean context. And there's often a narrative that they must just innovate, but there's something that you just can't innovate around. Now, I have an opportunity to sort of put that into the public realm. And because there's an element of credibility that's built, and because I don't have a say in this game, it helps to add a conversation. It helps to bring a conversation that can potentially make the business environment even easier for like a lot of these executives.
And let's be honest, it's not stuff that your typical exco, even middle management, are inclined to storify for a CEO or the market, frankly, because the incentives aren't always aligned in the direction of both their self-interest in the matter and the best for the business and the shareholders and the broader ecosystem. Someone's got to do this, man.
Yes, someone's got to do it, and I'm sort of like volunteering to do it. But it's not a very good business model at this point in time.
And it's not great if you're trying to make this work on an advertising model, which was your point.
The best model, in theory, for this would be a pure subscription model, where people pay and then you don't have the pressure of the advertising revenues. Now, challenge with subscription is that it's Africa. Disposable income to subscribing to one thing is very, very challenging. If it's subscription, then you're also then cutting out a lot of other people from the mix, because you want this to be information that's available to the public. An element I always also try to add in that is the educational portion of it. And I tell you, a lot of the DMs and people who message me are actually students. So students who are studying finance say, oh, I want to use one of your articles as a case study, or I want to get into finance because I read a lot of your stuff, or can you guide me to some resources? So there's a lot of like students or people who are reading, who are also using this as real-time case studies.
Funny enough, one of the biggest, most reliable sources of traffic to African Tech Roundup podcasts, particularly, are universities. You have universities and think tanks who actually make a lot of the podcasts recommended listening for their students and for cohorts and things of that nature. And yes, there was a point where we thought, there was an opportunity. We actually spoke to a top 5 management consulting firm several years ago about creating a licensed offer linked to that, so that, now we can literally coin that. And there's something to that, but also Harvard can afford it, but can University of Zimbabwe type thing? It's like, bruh.
Yeah, so that's the other element. So went through advertising, subscription, then sponsored posts. Those are actually very lucrative.
So are we talking about people who are like, hey, write about us, I will pay for you to do that?
Let me call them advocacy sponsored posts. This is where someone approaches you to write a positive story about a company without any sort of disclosure. So it's effectively pay for an opinion.
PR journalism.
That's actually very lucrative. But for me personally, that's one of the things I said I won't do at all, because
I can tell in reading your work that you don't do that. That's why you're on this. In fact, that's why you're here, bruv. It's because, one, I subscribe to the same philosophy, but I can tell in the work that you don't subscribe to it. And if the work didn't speak to that, I wouldn't think less of you per se, but I probably would think less of the work.
Yeah, and I think, look, there's a space for that, but I think particularly within like these ecosystems where there isn't much objectivity, right? It just wouldn't sit well with me. And unfortunately, that's also one of the areas where you can probably capture the most value from a financial perspective. I mean, if you think about it, right, an advertisement can cost thousands of dollars to run. And you just see that without actually thinking twice. Whereas an opinion piece has got like a lot of power to sway the readers significantly. So you can make a lot of money with that. And I think that's probably one of those areas where I probably would never do. In terms of like advertising, maybe I could consider it in some time. Who knows? Subscription, who knows? Opinion pieces, I think that's like the one where I draw the line, that like there's no world in which I can see that taking place. Now, if I have a positive opinion about a company, independently, I can publish that. For example, when I started the pre-list, which is a list of the best up-and-coming private companies, the companies that I've looked at, and I've got 2, I looked at them, I studied them, I read them, I'm like, this is a good company, these guys are doing great work, and I'll put that out there, but it's not paid, and it won't be paid. And if they're no longer a good company, they also have to be prepared for me to say, I don't think these guys are there. And I always make sure that even within like the first one I did the pre-list, I highlighted the risks. And there are risks that I have that I have identified for them that I'm hoping that they're going to keep, looking at as well. But fundamentally, that revenue stream is completely out. So now you're left with like sponsored disclosed posts, which could be an option in the future. But like that also requires a certain level of scale and infrastructure, because right now it's not set up that way.
The sort of biz dev cycle around sort of packaging that as a product and going to market and finding people who actually want to engage on that level.
Yeah. So to be honest, that there aren't many avenues that I've seen. The one that I have seen, which is also not a pure media play, to be honest, is on the financial education side of things. Because as I write, I'm using financial understanding in wisdom, right? And a lot of people find that valuable for their day-to-day life. And so publishing like a course on those type of things, say, okay, guys, this is how you actually do it if you want to do it for yourself. That's something that I'm open to, because it keeps your independence and integrity. And that's something that I will do. It's not at the time to fully go on, but I think something will happen soon, early next year. But that's also not, strictly speaking, a media play. That's more of a using media as an asset play. So in short, media is
an asset. You said tough. Media is in this instance, media is an asset, not a business.
In this particular instance. But to be clear, like I haven't yet set on a business model, because from a strategic perspective as well, right now I'm either in a blue ocean or in a desert, and I don't know what the difference is. Because if you're in a blue ocean, then you've got lots of opportunity. If you're in a desert, it's just never going to work. But I always remember the story about when Facebook was coming up, where they were doing something that was new, innovative, different. And the question about what the business model should be came up. And at the early days, the trend was to have people pay to join the Facebook. That was sort of like the fad, or try to run ads very early. And had they made the decision, for example, to be a subscription service where you have to pay to use Facebook, it would have never been the company that it is today. Because the business model, which ironically actually disrupted media, but the business model that they built where, hey, everything is free for the user, but we take your data and we place ads, is infinitely more profitable and is infinitely a better business than had they done the subscription model as well. So I'm also like, just building something and it's scaling, don't necessarily tie yourself to a business model yet, because at a certain level of scale, and you say network effects, the value you can extract might be from a different model. Who knows? Maybe you even just go 100% donation. Say, guys, Wikipedia style. I'm giving you information, users donate, and maybe that's how you capture value in that particular sense.
But also, you just said that, and I realized that, and this is not woe is me, but in a future version of being us, our connectivity profiles, which in my world of thinking include your skills, expertise, experience, and resources particularly. I think we're, relatively speaking, and I'm saying this not knowing much about your financial situation or your personal sort of family portfolio, we're probably resource light in a way that, I don't know, Jeff Bezos clearly isn't, to make a decision like, let me acquire the Washington Post as a service, one hopes, to the ecosystem in enabling it to perpetuate, but also to acquire an asset that will be complementary to the rest of my portfolio. And that might look different for you and I individually, given our profiles are very different, or anyone listening, frankly, who's trying to do the same thing and build an asset and is trying to ask themselves if this is worthwhile. Part of what I'm trying to figure out without projecting it on you is where might this reputational asset, African Tech Roundup in this instance, fit in the broader scheme of the portfolio I'm building at a family office level, quote unquote, but also potentially where I don't ever have a substantial family office to speak of, where might it fit comfortably and neatly and without compromise in the portfolio of someone else and continue to serve the purpose it's serving in the broader ecosystem, but also, add value to that portfolio.
I was actually, when I was driving, I was actually thinking about it, that like one of the other models for media assets is, I'll call it the billionaire model, right? Which is you find someone with significant disposable income or capital, I think that's rather, right? Who essentially says, you know what? I like what you're doing and what you represent. I'm going to bankroll this thing. Honestly, a lot of properties are sort of like in that space, right? Like the Washington Post, like we mentioned. I was actually listening to the Deal Book Summit where he was being asked, about the Washington Post and what his thoughts are. And he was very open.
So this is Jeff Bezos. And he was very open because the question was like, how do you draw that independence, that gap between your ownership and the independence of the organization and the institution? And he was like, look, I won't get involved. And the Washington Post has to be able to cover all of my companies in whichever way. The benefit of the Washington Post is that if they need money, I'm here. And that's the case. So it kind of feels wrong from a business model, right? Yeah, for like journalism purists, that's like just terrible.
So that's true. But like there's an element where, there's a saying that groups are oftentimes more unethical than individuals. I think having a single owner is better than having corporations running like media assets. So I think, for example, with News Corp, I'm not forgetting the how the structure is, where they've got super voting rights, whatever it is. But like, essentially, a few people actually determine what happens and set the boundaries for those type of things. And it might be a viable model because it probably means that your coverage of, let's say, Amazon, let's say, for example, so Washington, the coverage of Amazon might be questionable, but the coverage of everything else is still pretty okay. Whereas if you're driven by multiple corporations, then you're always trying to play to the tune of multiple corporations with multiple individuals and stuff of that nature. So
do you know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like we need to challenge the imagined benefits of what it looks like when we, quote unquote, whoever we is, whether it's like corporations, which are apparently more balanced than a single individual, or we as the people, own the thing than if it's one thing. And I think there's lazy narrative around, if one person owns a media platform immediately, it's completely discredited. The irony I'm starting to see in our practice, the irony is that the democratization potential of the internet and these social media platforms that have made it possible for you and I to become journalists.
Yeah.
Is so freaking dangerous. And part of why I think it's important to have conversations like this is to bring into the fore of our consciousness all of us who've decided to do this one, but more broadly, all of us who are ourselves trying to be part of making a name or projecting our own voices, or there needs to be a humility and a stewardship mindset that I think people think happens by default.
Yes. And like everybody can be a media organization now. And here's the crazy part, which I found, and it's probably one of the big bets I'm making, that, and it's also something for African Tech Roundup to think about, is that human beings trust humans more than they trust organizations. If you take like the large news organizations in the world, newspapers, those guys are struggling, while a Joe Rogan can get $100 million contract.
And help, I wouldn't say he single-handedly helped the president get into office, because that would be totally untrue. But definitely he did his part in a way, in an outsized way.
He had significant influence. And if you look at like even the number of views that like that interview had, right? But what's also worth noticing or picking up with like a Joe Rogan, for example, is that you have to build that credibility over a long time, right? Because what's likely, I think, is going to happen in the future is that there's going to be all of these sources of truth and information. And people are going to be like, but who do you trust? And the person you're likely to trust more is the one that you've seen take a stand for a very, 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 very long time. So now, for you to replicate Joe Rogan, for example, he's in such a blue ocean. It's a category of one situation. Like no one can replicate what he's been able to create. He's just a category of one. But it took an extremely long time to build up that credibility. So I do see with the democratization that individuals will take even more weight relative to organizations. Organizations are still going to be very, very important. And to take one step back, because I just wanted to close the loop on the whole business model topic. So reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? And it's to go back to what Fred Swenecker said, is that it's a combination of hard enough, passionate enough, and are you uniquely positioned? I have a little bit more of a uniquely positioned ability to try out certain business models because I can kind of keep the light on to some extent. Definitely not earning as much as I
You're not doing badly, but I understand what you mean.
And that's also become because, I mean, after like nearly 20 years of working in finance and moving 8 times and was it 6 years, 6 times in 8 years or 8 times in years? I can't remember, but like moving constantly, spending an incredible amount of money going to business school and all that type of stuff, right? It's given a slight buffer, it's not a very big buffer, right? But I also feel like I have the obligation to experiment because if I somehow figure out how to do this, it'll then mean that someone who doesn't have the same level of buffer in the future can just replicate. Because every model that we're seeing today, somebody tried it out, it worked, and now everybody's is moving that way, right? And as the world is changing and is shifting, and even in the African space, if I have the opportunity to experiment, which is what I'm doing, like I'm a literally walking case study, I'm going to do that and see where it potentially goes. At some point in time, it's not going to be viable anymore, and then I might have to tap out. But right now, I'm just going to try to experiment as far as possible. More like a startup type economics where you try to get growth and then try to figure out the profitability later, which sometimes doesn't work, and it might not work in this case. But who knows?
I love that you have a stewardship mindset to this that goes beyond, hey, let me see how I can sort of maximize everything I've accumulated vis-a-vis these skills, expertise, experience, in your case as well, resources. I think that's also something people don't account for sufficiently in terms of the privileged opportunity to do something like this well. Whether or not you're starting a podcast or a great newsletter like yours, which takes a significant amount of bandwidth and time that many people can't spare either because they've sold their time to a corporation or they literally have to focus on some other, revenue generating consulting work or whatever. I think there's a sense in which at some point, part of what you need to think about for yourself is my resource base, both in terms of sovereign resources and otherwise. And those sovereign resources are, your time, actual money, an actual runway that enables you to do that. A resource in my case is definitely being married to an incredible individual who is effectively a business partner who enables this. And we basically are building a portfolio together and she buys into the values and the stewardship mindset I have. You probably might not perceive it as much because I've probably always been the prominent face of the brand. But I can tell you that over the last 5 years, I've actually worked out of my system the desire to completely separate myself from the brand and create this business that has nothing to do with me, that agnostically works when I'm not in the room. And there's value in that, obviously. But I'm realizing now that to do that would be to deny the investment I've made personally, to deny the fact that while it's not like for like, Andile is African Tech Roundup, for the most part, African Tech Roundup is what it is because of what I have lent to it. And that's okay.
And who I think did this really, really, really well. And so I've got my, let's call it a vision board, if I can call it, of guys I've learned from and sort of inspirations in their own different ways. So I can never pronounce his surname. If I ever meet him, it's going to be a problem. Andrew Ross Sorkin, so the New York Times guy. So he started Deal Book, the newsletter, which was, I think, mergers and acquisitions focused. And I think he was still working at the New York Times. In fact, he probably still kind of works at the New York Times. But anyway, he started Deal Book, this newsletter, which became very, very, very popular. And then what happened is, if you look at how he structured the whole thing, like right now the Deal Book Summit is going on. It's Deal Book Summit with Andrew Ross Sorkin. And even the Deal Book newsletter, it's with Andrew Ross Sorkin, right? So it's like there's a brand, but he's also like the sub-brand. If you look at the Deal Book Summit, he's hosting all of the interviews. If you don't know who he is, if you remember the time when Elon Musk was on stage and basically told CEOs to go themselves, that was the guy who was interviewing him. So there's the company, then there's his name, and he's also an anchor on CNBCA as well. Mm-hmm. But he also wrote Too Big to Fail, a book, and he also produced and wrote the series Billions about the hedge fund guys, right? So it's like there's the organizations that he's worked with, but he's also created his own sort of a sub-asset, which allows him to then capture value in different ways, which maybe journalism might not be able to do explicitly, right? So another example is that oftentimes one of the unknown paths to becoming a venture capitalist is actually becoming a journalist. A lot of the earlier VCs were actually journalists who were covering all these companies, and they had the connections, so they knew when stuff was going to happen, and then they were able to sort of invest in some ways.
So that's like Jason Calacanis of This Week in Startups and Harry Stebbings of 20VC.
That's a very good example. Harry Stebbings of 20VC. So you know 20VC, but you also know the guy. And I think more and more that's going to be important, that yes, there's money and moves, but like there's also like person attached to it or people attached to it. And I think the harmony of those two.
You can say your name in the third person. There's money and moves and there's Tinashe Mukogo.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's money and moves and there's me. Let's just put it this way. So that's one of the things that I'm also looking at experimenting with from a business model perspective. And the reason why is that if this fails, there's always that risk mitigation element of it, right? Which we have.
Well, there's the INSEAD MBA, bruv. Well, you'll be okay.
So the one thing that media does do is that it does have an exponential effect, whereas like your day job doesn't. Because your day job, or most professions, and I've been there as well, it's what have you done for me lately? If your boss changes, your credibility is potentially gone. If you switch companies, you're oftentimes starting from scratch. And what you did yesterday doesn't necessarily carry over into tomorrow. With media, that's a little bit different. Because even if I publish a simple, basic post and 5 people subscribe, that's 5 people more than yesterday, right? And 5 more people where the exponential impact and network effects can particularly grow. So if I, in 5 years' time, have made 0 money from this, right? The hope is that if the bills are now just like, and I have to tap out, that I'll be able to use some of that capital to do something else. Do I want to do that? Probably no. But there's also the element of trying to mitigate your risk and be pragmatic, that at some point you might be in that situation.
And you're talking social capital here without trying to sound like a prophet, which I'm not. You will certainly not fail if that's the standard, in the sense that I used to have and probably still have to some degree as a hypothesis, that if you just figure out an area of value, a co-assigned value, so it's not just value to you, it's co-assigned to you and hopefully, to a point you made earlier, a sizable audience, but almost any audience, if you can identify that and then figure out a way to serve value into that gap consistently for 100 weeks, 100 months in a row, and you can commit to that, independent of whatever else works or doesn't work, whatever else you figure out from a business model perspective or not, you will not be in the same place you were when you started or when you made that decision. And the social capital that'll accrue, I call that investing in your connectivity, in a sense. You will accrue a certain level of goodwill and trust that cannot otherwise be accrued. I mean, there are many ways to accrue those things, but that very specific decision will help you accrue connectivity, growth in relationships, network access, and reputational equity that nothing else can do. And so that doesn't answer the question, unfortunately, will you get rich doing this? Will it pay off as well as Facebook did for Mark? But
there is an obligation, and there's a saying of that being a missionary versus being a mercenary. I always laugh and say that the only problem with being a missionary is that missionaries are usually poor.
And sometimes they get killed in those mission fields, bruv.
Sometimes they get killed in the mission field. So it's extremely difficult to balance. But I think there's an obligation to at least give it a strong attempt at a minimum. I think that's what we can at least set ourselves a goal to say, guys, let's at least give it a crack. And I actually see like huge opportunities even from like an African Tech Roundup perspective for you guys as well, and what you're doing. Because I think like, I would say your superpower is like that connectivity and the ability to connect and to bring people together as well. And I think we're all on the same journey of trying to figure out how to take all of those pieces and transform them into something that can capture value that's proportionate to the value that's being delivered. And I think for pretty much most media properties, especially within the African space, we're going to need to really rethink about what media is and how to capture value from it. And in some sense, business model innovation, let's call it that way. It's funny because I just wrote another piece, but this was actually on Twitter/X. Still call it Twitter. It's hard to call it X, but on Twitter.
Someone said, Mama called you Twitter. I call you Twitter.
Exactly. So it was actually about Tupperware. So Tupperware, they're now bankrupt, and then they're actually closing shop, unfortunately, in South Africa. But what was really interesting is that the business model that made them a success made them a failure. But I want to go back to the business model that made them a success, because how Tupperware was started by Earl Tupper, and he used to sell that Tupperware in hardware stores and department stores. And then a lady called Brownie, man, I'm actually just blanking on the name. It's Brownie, right? Wise. But anyway, she came and she had a background in marketing and sales, and also this new type of selling called home demonstrations. So she liked the product, and she went to him and said, "Hey, look, can you give me the rights to sell this, permission to sell your products?" And then she started what they call Tupperware parties, where you'd invite women and they'll all come and there'll be a product demonstration. She'll show you how to use the Tupperware. I think there was one experiment where they'll put liquid into one of their containers, and then, that Tupperware lid is like tough. Then they'll throw it and it didn't spill. And post-war, so homemaking became very, very important. Socializing for women 1 hour at home was very important, and everyone wanted to make a source of income. So it just worked so well, so much so that Earl Tupper was like, you know what? I'm hiring you as the VP, which was very, very rare for a woman that age. And they went all in on Tupperware parties and direct model. Like you couldn't buy Tupperware from a store, you had to buy it from an individual. And that's what the next 50 years was the foundation of their success. So the same product, the same quality of product, the same everything, but the business model was changed and it became a success. So in some senses, with the exact same African Tech Roundup, money and moves, it's possible that without changing anything else, if we can figure out a way to flip the business model on its head, then all of a sudden, this thing becomes a very profitable venture. And I do think that's what's going to happen. But it does take thinking about things in a completely different way and experimentation, because who would have thought that you could have a sales force of mothers at home being the primary drivers of a product that was being sold in a department store?
Women who aren't even on your payroll.
Who aren't even qualified sales reps or things of that nature. And so that's one of the things that I often obsess about, that value creation, really value capture mechanism, and trying to see, well, we know how to create value right now, publish and all that stuff, but the thing that we haven't really figured out is how do we capture value? Because if you can do those two things, create and capture value, what was something that was really difficult to do becomes phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
And the Tupperware story is also a story of network effects, actually.
Exactly, right? Because it's all about introductions to other people. So who knows? Maybe we need to have like a Tupperware business model for media. I don't know.
That's what we call podcasts. But dude, I mean, this has to be one of the longer conversations I've had with anybody in a while. And I'm really grateful that you said yes. I have just a few more questions, particularly for people who tuned in hoping for more pragmatic exposure to you as an individual and the work you do, because I really indulged myself on this one. I think you had a fairly long stint working for Siemens, and because of that stint, you and I haven't, at least as part of our shared histories, working within VC. You working within corporate VC, me working for an independent, standalone business backed by corporates. 54 Collective, formerly Founders Factory Africa. You at Next 47 within Siemens. And what would you say you got from that experience? Siemens specifically, the VC experience particularly, because I'm quite interested in that and a lot of people listening will be too. But more broadly, that as a corporate experience.
My first assignment within this broader Siemens group was within Next 47. And at the time, Next 47 was being sort of set up as more standalone venture capital firm, which was going to be a lot more external focused, a lot more commercially minded, like normal VCs are. Because sometimes corporate venture capital firms are a lot more internal and sometimes not necessarily even very profit driven. I mean, I was really excited because, post business school, it's always like VC is very well marketed. It seems like the most attractive career you could possibly have on this earth. And VCs sort of have this like swagger, if I can call it, about them, that most people just want to do VC. Getting into it, and at the time my assignment was more to help with the actual setup, but it wasn't as exciting. It was interesting, but it wasn't as attractive as it made to seem. For example, if you have a lot of investments and they're not doing well, there's nothing you can do about it, right? And that's one of the things I found was like, you are actually not able to make that much impact a lot of the times because the founders are the ones who are running the companies. So you can give guidance if you've invested in a company, but the actual turnaround is highly dependent on what the actual organizations are doing. And a lot of deals don't work out. Like a lot of companies die. Like most companies die. And that's not really necessarily a very exciting thing to experience. And even the ones that do well, like the time between when you invest and when you potentially see the upside, it can take a very, very long time. And so for me, when I was there, I also realized that actually it's probably not the ideal career path for most people, actually. It's probably the easier career path if you've been an entrepreneur and maybe you've exited and now you're sort of investing.
And maybe if the model, not to promote, 54 Collective's model, although I happen to rate, hybrid models that pair investments with venture building support. But yeah, maybe that's also missing sometimes in the model.
Yeah. The venture building model, because, man, like seeing how the mechanics work, like, okay, so the game is try to get in with the best investors, get in as early as possible, and replicate in a sense, right? And in the African space specifically, I definitely agree with the whole venture building model in the African space, because there's a lot more you need to build out. There's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a lot more support that's necessary. And honestly, like with the VCs, in my VC experience, that like Africa is not even a consideration in some cases. I mentioned Africa once and it wasn't even like, oh, we'll even consider it. In some.
Yeah, that's because you were based in Germany, right?
Germany, yeah. I was based in Germany. So it was a German VC. Offices, I think, was in...
You were our man abroad.
Yeah. So I was abroad. So also take that into consideration when I'm talking, because I'm talking about, like, let's say global VCs, that they weren't really looking into the African space. But yeah, VC, it's tough. I mean,
you were lucky to be able to rotate out of that once you made that discovery.
Yeah.
And look, correct me if I'm wrong. It is my sense, and not to make a meal of like working at Siemens, whatever that means, or being our man abroad and all of that. But it is my sense when I look at your stint at Deloitte, I feel like it was really impactful, informative. I sense that your time at Siemens was similar, but in a different way. Maybe that's what I'm trying to dig at.
So at Deloitte, I worked in Zim, the US, Nigeria. With Siemens, I worked in Germany, South Africa, and the US.
With INSEAD in between.
With INSEAD in between in France and Singapore. And within like Siemens, I also had regional responsibility in my last role. So it was actually Europe, Middle East, and Africa. The US is just big enough in of its own. So I did have like a good feel of what was going on in general. To drill down maybe into the African topics and my understanding of, let's say, the VC space and some of the challenges that are there. And I'm not an expert in VC by any chance, right? But when dealing with like Germany and the US, the number of M&A deals, IPOs and all that type of stuff, or exit opportunities that were there was just so many. Whereas one of the things I wonder is that, are there enough exit paths within the African space to actually create the ecosystem that startups need? Which is why the model probably needs to be less pure venture, in the sense where you put in some money and then you sit back and wait for an exit. You kind of have to build the exit in some sense, which I think the venture builder model works better, because in some cases then maybe even get the business to become profitable before you exit as well.
I just realized an interesting link between what you've just said and the work you currently do. Now, granted, you are covering mostly Africa's largest and most successful listed businesses, but I think there's something to be said for, there's a dearth of exits, which I agree, but I think there's also a dearth of the exit story. I think even when they do occur, the level of thoughtful analytical treatment you give to like the work you do on Money and Moves, there's that missing for the exit story, whether you invested super early and you were able to exit in a pre-seed round or through a secondary in a pre-series A or whatever. That perspective from the investments, from the investor side and from the founder side, and like the real grind of what went, and perhaps in that world, the way you do your work wouldn't actually apply, because you actually need insider access to all of that information and that sharing. On
exits, there'll have to be another, like a stream in a sense.
I could see that though. And maybe we'll talk offline. I have some thoughts.
Yeah. No, there could be, I mean, the portfolio has to expand some coverage of different things. I will also throw one spanner in the works, in the sense that so venture capital and startup world, generally when you say that, the association is tech. The crazy thing is, what I've seen, or at least for part of the pre-list, there are companies that are not in tech that are growing at rates that you'd only see in tech globally. TDW, for example, right? One of the companies I've covered, if you like plot their graph, you'll think it's a tech company, but they're actually doing property development, building, and construction. The other company, which, I mean, we're just in the early stages of conversations, but it's microfinance. But my goodness, a phenomenal, ridiculous levels of growth, like stuff that I was like, oh, blown away in a sense. So you have all of these non-tech companies, or let's call it non-tech startups, that are doing extremely well. But I think because of the way we've interpreted the VC fast-growing company, the coverage does sometimes end to be focused on your software businesses or whatever. So that's the other element where I saw like maybe there's a bit of a blue ocean type space of also profiling these guys. Because there are people who've done some phenomenal stuff as well. But I think there's also like, I think how we made it in Africa does a lot of that as well.
So what's interesting, they do. So we've taken, let me just go ahead and say African Tech Roundup with Andile Masuku have taken, so our editorial lens now is actually at the intersection of the emerging digital economy and what I loosely dub the real economy. I literally imagine a Venn diagram, and in the middle there, I'm finding it most beneficial to think of that frame. Why? Because most of the oversimplifications about the African digital transformation trajectory, about how to make it in Africa, about, who's who and who should partner with and what good looks like in terms of entrepreneurship, who should be an entrepreneur, is entrepreneurship working, what's tech entrepreneurship, are startups a thing, is VC an actual asset class? Most of those oversimplifications and projections are made at that intersection, for better and for worse. And I think for a long time have been part of that oversimplification, ironically, as a platform, which is perhaps a great place to land this conversation. Why I love Money and Moves. I can't recommend it enough. If you're not already subscribed, it's moneyandmoves.com, and follow them on Twitter. You're also great on LinkedIn. Definitely follow worthy on LinkedIn personally as Tinashe Mukogo. And I just have a sense that, voices like yours they're just not coming up enough. And I'm also just inspired listening to you and how patient you're willing to be and big picture. I think there's some younger people trying to do what we do at African Tech Roundup, what you do at Money and Moves, but I think they're much more desperate for an immediate return on their input, and it's compromising their ability to actually make something that matters in the long term. And so it's just really inspiring to have someone like you commit to something like this at this level and spend what is now well over an hour talking to me about it. So thank you so much for being on the African Tech Roundup. Tinashe!
Thank you. And a big shout out to Andile for connecting. Super happy to have you as a contact. And I think this will be one of many in some ways, and the collaboration will continue.
The man's humble too, which is also a rather rare in these streets where everyone's crowning themselves, this and that. All right, man. Once again, thanks.
Thank you. It was great doing this.